All right, people. Fear is the mind killer. Indeed. We're back. This is our second to last podcast for October. Just in general, what an eventful, fun-filled month this has been just in general. And Chris, we're here to talk about probably one of my most anticipated just properties of the year in general. I've been waiting to see what they were going to do with this movie since they first announced that they were doing it back in 2018. You got anything to say before we get going?
Yeah, of course. I thought this was, it's certainly the conversation I think we were waiting to have.
Yeah,
And I'll leave it
most
at that. I
definitely.
think you guys are in for a treat today.
Most definitely, either way, because I've got my thoughts on it. I'm really interested to hear Chris's. All of that and more. Stay tuned. All right, Chris, after what seems like forever, Frank Herbert's iconic 1965 novel Dune has finally made its way to the big screen in only so many words, as obviously this is the latest simultaneous HBO Max theater drop. I'm kind of sick of just talking about those movies in general and talking about how it affects the box office, but at the very least, it looks like for now, hopefully at least, I mean, the weekend's not over yet, but it looks like this film has been a success overall. Famously, this property in general is a really interesting property, both with its journey from the book to the big screen, but apparently even when it seems like everything was working right behind the scenes, they got the right director for it, they got a giant cast, they got a giant budget. Then of course obviously the pandemic came in and screwed up just the not the actual behind the scenes thing, but the viewing property. It looks like, so needless to say, Dune has been one of those properties that is just been very problematic. But it's so strange because this is a novel that has been a source of inspiration for some of our favorite creators, like Lucas. Heavily stated that he was influenced by Dune. George R.R. Martin, with writing the Game of Thrones books, stated that he was influenced by Frank Herbert's novel. Like so many different people. Orson Scott Card, famously, cited Dune as an inspiration for him when he was writing Blade Runner. I think that's ironic considering that he writes Blade Runner, Ridley Scott adapts Blade Runner, and then Denis Villeneuve does the sequel to Blade Runner as his precursor to Dune. This is also an interesting installment in the sense that this is the next, obviously, like, big project from Denis Villeneuve, who is a director that has been getting a lot of clout in recent years, but one of the things that I want to try to break down today is whether some of that clout is earned and how much of that is actually deserved. But first and foremost, so obviously I know that going into this, your knowledge just on the Dune property, I mean, it's kind of a niche property just in general, but like, I guess my question is, like, what did you heard about this property beforehand? Like, did you know anything? Did you know anybody that knew anything about this? Like, what was your familiarity just with Dune overall as a project? Were you just looking forward to this as like a new upcoming, like, gigantic looking sci-fi movie?
I went to film school. I know about Dune. I just hadn't had the time to sit down and read it or watch like the Fincher version or whatever. I just never got around to it. It's one of those things where it's always piqued my interest, but it's something that just I think because of like the history too, and the fact that it was never like really successful, it was never that appealing to me. I mean, successful in the novelization, but for the adaptation to get off the ground and film, like they had the 2000 series, which apparently was just a mini series, and then the 1984 film, which came and went. They didn't get any follow ups to that, and clearly, like this is marketed as part one right there in the beginning when you first see the title of Dune in this movie, part one. Very much so, alluding to the fact that there will be a part two, maybe a part three. It feels like it's one of those, hey, we can make this a trilogy type things. But I guess what I've heard and the research I did a little bit on good old Wikipedia about Frank Herbert, it depends on it's like director's choice, dealer's choice. Like however you want to wrap this up, it could just be a part one, part two. It could go 5 parts. It seems like there's enough material here for the director to sort of determine what he wants to take from Herbert's source material and what he wants to leave behind, he or she. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's kind of my familiarity with it.
Well, because the interesting thing is that obviously Dune, the novel, is not the only installment in the novelization series. Herbert famously wrote, I think Herbert wrote like 3 more novels in the series, and then it was an estate that ended up picking it up. Like famously, there's the Children of Dune series. There's the direct sequel to Dune. Like the whole thing is that it really was essentially like kind of the novelistic version of Star Wars and Game of Thrones before kind of Star Wars and Game of Thrones were a thing, which is interesting because I feel like my elevator pitch to anybody in the modern day who is unfamiliar with this franchise, with this property, would be to pitch it as an elevator pitch between Star Wars and Dune, because that's literally it. Like you could, again, just from watching the property, like, because just for my money, I've read roughly the first half of the novel, which is roughly what this film encompasses. And again, the allusions are all there. They're in the novel. They're in the book. Like, you could see the allusions to Star Wars. You could see the allusions to Game of Thrones, just as far as like the politics and like the divide between the houses and everything. And then as far as, there being, it being essentially another differing account of a Messiah story, the good old fashioned Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. Like, all of that is there. That's neither here or there. I guess my whole thing that I wanted to break down before we really broke down this movie is, I think it's interesting that you brought up the whole element of this being a part one, because the whole thing with the Lynch film is the Lynch film was supposed to be the entire novel. But famously, obviously, when David Lynch was hired for that movie, I mean, I guess a little history just on that, on the adaptation in general. The film was originally set to be, I think, the first ever film. They've been talking about, obviously, film adaptations because Dune was just one of those books that came out in the 1960s and 70s that when it came out, it was such a huge, like, hot button property that they're like, okay, we have to capitalize off this. And they went through like several different directors throughout the decades. Famously, the first big adaptation that they were going to attempt was from experimental filmmaker Alejandro Jodorowsky, who did The Holy Mountain. The big thing was, but he wanted to, this guy is literally insane as far as filmmakers go. He wanted to make the movie like 12 hours long. He wanted Pink Floyd in 1970s, keep in mind. He wanted Pink Floyd to do the music. He wanted Orson Welles, Mick Jagger, Salvatore Dali, Gloria Swanson. Really a strange cast in general. He wanted to go for it. He definitely wanted to go for it. And even though the film clearly never got off the ground, it's still the subject of one of the most famous documentaries ever made with Jodorowsky's Dune, just about kind of the behind the scenes making, what led to, the falling apart of that film, how kind of, what piece he was able to accomplish. You get to see some of the concept art about it. Like, it really, really is fascinating. And then obviously, David Lynch is one of the people that George Lucas courts to potentially direct Return of the Jedi in '83 after his success with Eraserhead and the Elephant Man. Lynch turns it down, but then he decides to do the movie. And the movie is the original 1984 Dune that Lynch directed is famously one of those movies that is kind of talked about throughout Hollywood history as being not just a disaster, but also clearly a studio hack job, that like Lynch left the project like halfway through. He disowned the movie. The last entire third of that movie is very clearly studio reshoots, because what I'll give the 84 adaptation is that the 84 adaptation, at least for the first 2/3, at the very least, like, feels really solid and really interesting. It's got all the, the 80s grandeur, like the giant sets and the really hokey over-the-top acting and the crazy costumes and the insane practical effects. Like, it's got all that, I will say. My biggest problem with that is that the movie's an hour 40 minutes long when it clearly needs to be a 2.5-hour long movie. Needs to. And so, obviously, after the failure of that movie, they've been trying to adapt this for like the last couple of years. Like you said, they had the TV miniseries in general. And I think my biggest thing that I was the most excited about was hearing that Denis Villeneuve was back in 2018 was announced that he was going to be doing a new adaptation of this after, I wouldn't say the success, but after his recent effort with Blade Runner 2049. I think it's really interesting that obviously he pursues two back-to-back, like kind of semi-quasi reboot, readaptation sequels to 80s properties that weren't necessarily successful at the time, but have kind of gained this like massive cult hit like status legacy within film history. Obviously, Dune and Blade Runner aren't exactly synonymous, but Blade Runner famously was not a box office success when it came out back in 82, and now has gone on to like, become hailed as like one of the greatest science fiction films, one of the best films ever made, And what Denis brought to Blade Runner 2049, even for me, was actually like really fascinating and really different and really kind of unlike anything that I was expecting. He has kind of a visual style and flair unlike most of the directors. I feel like he's kind of a little bit of Chris Nolan and a little bit of Sam Mendes mixed with like his own kind of signature flair. So needless to say, when I heard that he was doing this, I was actually really excited. I'm like, okay, Denis' movies for me have been pretty hit or miss so far. I've liked certain movies, but I've liked the majority of his movies. I definitely think he's got a sense of scale. He's one of the few people that can like actually still utilize CG with practical effects in a really interesting and meaningful way that doesn't feel like it's super distracting and in your face and overly cartoony. Like, he's one of the last people in Hollywood that really has like a great sense of scale to his movies. And so definitely, I think that was reinforced when I saw the trailers. The trailers for this were amazing. The fact that he paid homage to Jodorowsky's Dune by using the Pink Floyd songs in the trailer, I thought was incredible. The cast for this...
Oh, sorry. No, that's just really interesting to hear about the whole Pink Floyd thing and him knowing his history and doing his research, because it did feel very lived in, and nothing felt, I mean, we were introduced to new elements in this, because so far I'd say that this is the most successful, getting this franchise effort off the ground. And we'll see where it goes because of the HBO Max of it all. But again, we've had that conversation ad nauseum here at the show. but it's still a factor and a possible reason why we might not get the sequel that we felt we were promised. But I do agree with you in regards to Villeneuve and the way that he was able to sort of make it all feel very tangible. Like I felt like I could have gone to the planet. The desert felt very real. He didn't abuse the fact of the giant sandworms. I love now going back in time and seeing Lucas's homage with the worm and the asteroid, and I believe it's Empire.
Yep,
But
Empire,
again,
and
I'm
then even
still
with the Sarlacc pit in Return of the Jedi, even that.
right. Yeah, you can definitely exactly. That's definitely another great homage. I think it is a little unfortunate that and I love Star Wars with all my heart. Again, it's the only other creative property in my life as a kid that made me want to be a creator that wasn't something musical related. So obviously it'll always have a special place in my heart regardless of how Disney wants to continue to butcher it and destroy it. But all that aside, I think it is a little unfortunate that the film version of this didn't come out first, because while I thought it was a very well made film and I love Villeneuve's style, although I think you left the director out there when you were sort of accrediting him to a mini Chris Nolan, and I forgot who else you mentioned. I think Zack Snyder was here on the B team. I don't think he wanted his name attached to this for whatever reason, but there was way too many pointless slow motion moments. I get it. We're building suspense, we're building drama, and these actors are all, I'd say, what it has in common with the Dune movie that didn't make it to screen, the one that the documentary is about. They
Yeah,
all got good-looking people, so you don't mind
yeah.
seeing them in slow motion, but enough, please. You could have shaved 15 minutes off this and kept the pace a little more interesting and engaging. So I do think it's unfortunate that Star Wars and Lord of the Rings hit the screen before this, and Game of Thrones in this way with the technology we have now. And it's unfortunate that in 84 this wasn't able to cement itself, because it did feel a little what's the word, borrowed. And I know it's not, because of the history and how much of an impact, at least in George Lucas's life, this made on him. But it just is a little unfortunate that that's the case, because I do agree with your points about Villeneuve. I think he's a very polarizing director. It's obviously no shock that people either love or hate his films. There doesn't really seem to be a neutral opinion there, which is fine, because stylistically, I do think he does bring some of that classic filmmaking, that patience that I feel we've just lost as a society in general, to just allow a moment to naturally play out and happen on screen. It's really a lost art, as we have these like constant barrage of big action blockbuster after blockbuster after blockbuster. You kind of lose the elegance, which I definitely felt there was some in this movie. But at the end of the day, I just think it's unfortunate that this was, it seems like it's the last to enter the arena. And because of that, I think it's weird that it's fighting an uphill battle, because again, it's so touted by all of the titans of which the shoulders it stands on is Dune. So it's just a strange concept for me, and I felt that that was worth bringing up before we specifically dissect this movie, as we're talking about the impact and we're talking about sort of where this franchise came from and who it helped inspire and what it helped create, really.
Yeah, I think it's interesting just in general that you talk about kind of like Denny's take on it, as far as like, specifically those specific moments that may have kind of prevented this from achieving all that it could be. Because I have similar thoughts, but I don't know if it's necessarily for the reasons that we may think. But I guess I guess just to kind of finish up my thoughts before I get into my thoughts of the movie. You're right, as far as like, I find it so fascinating too that you said that about this movie, because that's literally what everybody was saying about Blade Runner, the 2049 movie, when he did that. Because the whole thing that they were saying
Huh.
is like 2017, that's like right on the cusp, as we're kind of entering like the peak Marvel age and like the peak action blockbuster phase. And then this movie comes out, it's a box office flop, but it's critically acclaimed. Everyone is saying, wow, like the fact that we get a movie like this on this scale with this level of elegance and tackling, you just don't get that with movies just in general. Like even Chris Nolan, who we both love as a filmmaker, even he's starting to like, his movies are starting to get into like, that kind of fast pace, momentum, everything. There always has to be something happening on screen, as far as that goes. Like Denny, at the very least, he's still one of the few directors that gets like $300 million budgets and will actually like just let the camera sit on his actors and not have to immediately cut away to something else. He really, the thing that I loved is about Denny is that he understands scale in a way that very, very few other directors do. Like he understands that in order to make something feel truly huge, You have to capture the people when they're at their smolls. And I love like these massive backdrops. They don't feel kind of forced in your face. He's not pulling like a Terrence Malick where he's more obsessed with capturing the scenery than he is with actually directing the actors. I think that, again, like the sets in this are tremendous. The use of wide shots with the interspersement of the cinematography and the editing is amazingly well done. He trades up his normal cinematographer, Roger Deakins, obviously, in order to go with cinematographer Greig Fraser, but it doesn't impact like this. It doesn't impact the visuals at all. I love the sense of scale. You hit it right on the head as far as this movie truly feels like the first movie in a while that feels like a world that like I can actually like live in and like see like I could the like when the one guy is like pouring the water on the palm trees when they hit Arrakis, I'm like, wow, those you could tell those are actually palm trees. And like even with the use of the CG with the worms, it's like, wow, this is like actually a great blend of practical and CG effects. Like this is literally like I haven't seen this since what George Miller was able to do with the Mad Max movie that came out a couple of years ago. You know, I think it's interesting. Obviously, two movies both set in the desert, but I guess kind of if we're going to use this as a transition really into my spoiler-free thoughts before we kind of really dissect and break down this movie. There's a lot that I want to talk about with this movie. What I'll say is that for this being one of my most anticipated movies of the year, I think it's safe to say that for the most part, no movie that I've really been looking forward to this year, with the exception of like two, really, have really held up to the standards that I thought. It's the year 2021. Every single blockbuster, I'm just not going to be able to get a great blockbuster unless it's the Suicide Squad, specifically from Warner Brothers. And just the fact, hey, it just makes me even more happy that we got the Suicide Squad. But what I'll say is that the parts of this movie that were great were fucking incredible. I will say that. And as far as how he handled the adaptation of the parts from the book, spot on. Like, spot on. The parts that I read from the book, which literally, it's really ironic because I'm still not quite through the book, but the part where I left off is literally the part where this movie ends, right? The movie literally opens as Dune Part 1, and the parts that they nailed everything. Like, as far as him really wanted to use this movie and take it as an attempt to introduce you to this world, to really make you understand like all the different peoples and cultures that happen in this universe. Because the interesting thing about this universe is in facet, this isn't like a Star Wars where it's set in like a fantasy in another galaxy or whatever. This is like our universe, but in the far distant future. That's the interesting thing kind of about what Frank Herbert brought to this, And I think Denis did a fantastic job of capturing that as far as introducing us to Arrakis, introducing us to like kind of the economics, the political situation of it all. I think he handled it really tactfully. I love the introduction to all the characters. This is a massive cast too. And again, this just shows that like Denis is one of the last people who can actually get this type of a cast. Obviously, it helps that he had Warner Brothers backing him up, but like he's one of the last few directors that like these giant name actors will pop up in for like a scene and do. You know, like you had Barkhad Abdi and Edward James Olmos and all these and Robin Wright and all these and Dave Bautista and all these super famous actors that popped up for like one scene in Blade Runner 2049. And now you've got a cast that includes, again, this is a cast that includes like 3 Marvel actors, a DC actor, a Star Wars actor, and what's it called? And then Zendaya, who aside from being a Star Wars actress is like one of the few like kind of up and coming, like kind of hip with the young teen crowd that like movie star celebrities that they actually recognize, which obviously that becomes few and far between. So this is like no small feat, like what this director is able to accomplish. Like there's a reason why he's able to get like this batch and this massive amount of talent. But I guess what my problems come from, they don't necessarily come from the things that have to do with the movie itself, but more so around the movie, kind of the treatment of it. So that's kind of where I want to use that to like kind of end my spoiler-free thoughts and kind of dive into like our dissection of the film just in general.
Sure.
But
yeah, before we do that though, the audience, we love you guys and we hope you join our community. If you haven't already, please subscribe, hit the like button on this video and turn on the bell so you get notified every time we post content and have interesting conversations about movies like this. We'd love to continue to bring you content like this, and that's your way you can help us for free. Continue to do that. So hope you guys enjoy the show, and let's get into it. Don, what's the next topic?
absolutely, yeah. So let's talk about like kind of what happens in this movie. So obviously, for those who are kind of unfamiliar with just Dune in general, haven't read the book, haven't read the Wikipedia profile, have no like conception of what goes in. Basically, it takes place in our universe set in the very, very far future, where kind of the economics, the politics, just everything kind of surrounding just this world in general all centers around this product called spice. It's this product that can give certain people mental powers, but it also allows for them to achieve kind of intergalactic space travel. And it also, which basically, which greatly affects their trade routes just in general. It basically allows them to essentially accomplish what they're able to accomplish just in the future in general. And it kind of centers around House Atreides, who are one of the great royal houses that rule over the water planet Caladan. We're introduced to our main character, Paul, who's the heir to the house, along with his parents, his father, the Duke Leto Atreides, and then his mother, the Lady Jessica, who is a part of this kind of sorceress sect called the Bene Gesserit. Basically, they are appointed, but their house is appointed by the Padishah Emperor of the universe in order to take over Arrakis, which is this desert planet that is the sole center point for mining spice. It's the only places you can find spice in the entire universe. Arrakis, for the longest time, was in the control of House Atreides' mortal enemies, House Harkonnen, which is led by the Baron Harkonnen, portrayed in the film by Stellan Skarsgård. Basically, think of it essentially like sort of the conflict between the Starks and the Lannisters, as far as in order to get some concept of the rivalry between them. So the Atreides basically arrive and overtake the mining operations on Arrakis. And this film, which again adapts roughly the first third and a half of the novel, sees what happens once the Atreides inherit Arrakis, that once they discover how kind of they've been played by the Emperor and the Harkonnens, and kind of what transpires from there. Basically, what you end up seeing in this film, it's ironic because story-wise, just in general, right? The film kind of almost plays out like a little Hamlet-esque in the end, or a little bit Lion King-esque, where you see essentially the entire destruction of this house before you even really get into the main crux of the story, where it feels like, because this is captured the first third of the novel, right? You see House Atreides occupy Arrakis, and then it feels like almost immediately after kind of all the setup and exposition is done, you immediately see their downfall, where you have the Harkonnens immediately invade, bomb the hell out of them, basically murder almost everyone in general. This is for a movie of this scale with this level of sci-fi, this turns into a pretty bleak movie just from a story standpoint in general. It's also combined with the fact that the main character Paul, who's portrayed by Timothée Chalamet, is also having these visions that he doesn't quite understand. And there's basically, some hints that are being dropped throughout the movie, both by the Bene Gesserit and then by the native Fremen, who are the natives who occupy Arrakis, who were constantly, persecuted and at war with the Harkonnens when the Harkonnens occupied Arrakis, which is that they believe that Paul is kind of this mythical messiah figure that they have in their religion, that will be known as Muad'Dib, basically. It's
you mean Anakin Skywalker?
Pretty much, exactly. Again, you guys know this. This is not anything new. This is not anything kind of new story development as far as that goes. Again, there was a reason why.
And I will
you can
say
see the illusion here.
Yeah. The illusions are definitely very clear, and I will say it is very Shakespearean. You even have some classic betrayal and all of those trappings that make Shakespeare so classic and so fundamental in archetypal storytelling like this. So yeah, continue. I think that was a nice little thread that you tied there, because it all comes full circle. You spoke about Campbell in the beginning of this podcast, and while this is a hero's journey, I mean, many hero's journeys encompass a whole cosmogenic cycle, and I think that's the really cool thing about these types of hero's journey stories. When you kind of study them on a broader scale like we do in this podcast, I'm talking about your Lord of the Rings, your Dunes, your Star Wars, your Marvels. These are many journeys within an overall narrative that pushes the worlds that they're in forward. And so it's really cool when you can sort of look back and dissect and see that while this is set in a distant humanity, so it really is somewhat grounded when you realize there aren't big green men coming down and lasering everyone. It's humans doing mean things to humans like we have now. And then when you look back in our reality here outside of the Dune verse, and you see that, well, Shakespeare was just another stepping stone in our evolution of storytelling. It all comes back to Campbell in this type of
right.
And this podcast is all coming full circle as we speak. This podcast is like a mini cosmogenic cycle. I think the audience could use that context to sort of understand where I think the conversation will go, at least from what I contribute going forward.
Oh, of course. And as far as just bouncing off that point in general, I mean, the signs are there, because Denis also borrows a very classic thing that old Hollywood used to do all the time, which is that they make all the hero. It makes it very easy to distinguish and differentiate between the good guys and the bad guys, where the good guys are all very much the very pretty, very pearlesque, very very fairly bearded, well muscled, hard stocky soldiers, and the bad guys are all super grotesque, super ugly. They're pale, they're vampiristic, they look mutated, the Baron, that famously, obviously, Baron Harkonnen. The most notable characteristic about him is that the character is so morbidly obese that he literally needs to use a floating apparatus to float around because he can't walk. Obviously, the whole, and you think that this version is disgusting. You should have seen the 84 version of that character, where he's also got this weird, terrible acne that's going on throughout his face. Obviously, his nephew, you're only introduced to one of his nephews in this novel, obviously the Beast Raven, which is the Dave Bautista character. But the thing that I think I appreciated first and foremost, and besides the scale and the scope, which again, like, not to harp on that too much, but like, again, Denny truly, once again, is a master of the visuals. Like, oh my God, like how he was able to capture like Arrakis, again, the sandworms, the gyrothopters, the look of Caladan and Arrakis, the look of Gidi Prime, the look of all these characters. Again, he's able to capture the elegance kind of the new technology while still imbuing it with a sense of kind of old school filmmaking. And that's something that, again, I really can't say about any other filmmaker just today in general. Like, so, and I love that. And I love just how lived in this world felt. And I love like kind of following along with these characters as they went on their journeys and kind of getting to know each and every one of them. And the fact that we had a film that was pretty much entirely exposition, like I've told you this before, first acts and almost anything are usually the parts where we're getting to spend time with the characters and we're getting to know them before the crux of the action picks up. I really, really dug that just in general, And as far as the casting goes, what I'll say is not every single actor, I think, worked entirely. I still have slight problems with Timothée Chalamet as a lead actor just in general. And I still don't necessarily know if he was the right person for this. But again, like Josh Brolin as Gurney Halleck, Oscar Isaac as Duke Leto, Stellan Skarsgård as Baron Harkonnen, Rebecca Ferguson as Lady Jessica, Javier Bardem as Stilgar, the leader of the Fremen. I'm like, every single person, you could just tell, like, they were really bringing their all. And I never watched any one of these guys and like was distracted by kind of their movie star artifice, which is really, really difficult usually to do in a setting like this, because so much of the time these types of actors get cast because they're playing off their movie star artifice. But this was the first time in a while where I feel like, wow, no, I feel like I'm watching these characters, just as far as like, what I got from reading them in the books, in a way that I feel like even the Lynch version didn't cover. As much as I love Kyle MacLachlan in the original, Kyle MacLachlan got some sense of like, oh, he's doing some weird Lynchian things here and there, And like, I really love how Denny was able to mix his style perfectly with the sensibilities of the novel. Like whenever a creator can do that, I always give them credit for that, just in general, even though I know it's obviously films, not books. But again, I was a reader first and foremost, so I always give credit where credit is due as far as that goes.
Yeah, I definitely hear all that. I think that I agree with the first act being such an awesome way to get into the world, get your feet wet. I think it did a great job, as this was, for most of us, a completely new universe we're about to go live in, and no pun intended, a new sandbox we were about to really explore. And so with that being said, I think he did an amazing job of sort of easing us in, but also giving us moments that didn't feel exposition-y for exposition's sake. Really just, like you said, that one scene, which is a very notable and memorable scene where, Chalamet's character, Paul, is talking to one of the workers in the garden, and it's the sacred palm tree. And that's just such a beautiful exchange to sort of establish the feel, the way that the planet Arrakis respects life, because there isn't much of it, while sort of giving you amazing characterizations. Like, Paul is this royalty. He's not below, though, or above speaking to the servants. I mean, he is good-natured in heart and will speak to anyone. And I just think that little moments like that are kind of what I meant earlier when I said that, his style doesn't quite fit the societal norms that we currently live in, where it's not all flash, it's not all flair. But that's, I think, very welcomed for me personally as an audience member in this film in specific, because one of the things I think, and I won't take it too far in this direction, but I think it needs to be said, that I highly dislike about the Disney Star Wars, and I'm not saying George Lucas is the most elegant filmmaker, but he still understood good characterization moments, and he knew how to let his characters live and breathe within the spaces that he created. And I just feel like Disney was just forcing moments and exposition and funny jokes and things into this universe that we all love. And so it's really great to see Villeneuve sort of not play ball, not play by the norms that we've set, and sort of do what he felt was right. And I really think that because of moments like that, I can sort of forgive Chalamet as a lead. I do hear you. I do think that physically, from his body type, I think he was perfect, because I'm curious to see if we do get more movies, if he grows. I mean, I do think he had the look for the character you sort of want to rise and become the chosen one. But I've always sort of felt him as a bit of a dull performer. Even in one of my favorite films, Lady Bird, he is just one of the many love interests that Lady Bird encounters as through her growth and her late teenage to early college years. But he was sort of like a device in that film, and I just don't know. I think Villeneuve does an amazing job behind the camera, and his co-performers really elevate him in a way that I think without careful casting and without, I'd say, pretty immaculate direction throughout the entirety of this film, I think he would struggle if he was in someone else's hands. I just don't see him, and I'm afraid now that we've lost the great performances of Jason Momoa and Oscar Isaac, to name a few. Where can he take this? I know we'll be introduced to new characters. We were at the very end of the film, which we'll get into the way that this film concludes in a second. But I just, Zendaya is another one too who's always worried me on screen. I feel that these actors are young and they clearly are talented and they have a lot of promise and a lot of hope. I wonder how they will pick up the mantle, and I wonder if it's going to be yet another obstacle that this franchise has to traverse throughout the many that we clearly touched upon in the first section of this podcast.
Right. So I think that's a good transition into kind of the second half of this podcast, because it's one of the rare instances of in our podcast history where I feel like all of my problems with this tie together into one, because it's not all entirely HBO Max. It's not all entirely Denny and what he decided to do with this is the one part. It's not entirely because of like just the story in general, where it went. It's not entirely with the casting. It all kind of ties in together as far as that goes, because you're right, because that is the unfortunate thing, is because of where this half of this movie leaves off with this half of the novel. As far as that goes, we lose half the people that we're introduced to. Obviously, the character of Gurney Halleck. Again, with how it concludes in this movie, obviously I know where it goes, but I won't spoil it for the people who don't know, who haven't read the book. But like, we leave this movie and like we don't know what happens to him. Again, Piter de Vries, the Mentat character, that is the Baron's Mentat. He's dead by the end of this. But Duke Leto by Oscar Isaac, dead by the end of this. Jason Momoa's Duncan Idaho, dead by the end of this. Like, half the characters that we're introduced to in this film are dead by the end of this film, and that's one small piece of how it factors into my problems that I have just in general. But I feel like the number one instance where we can go with is with the ending, because famously, what I will say is that even though you're right, Chris, this was marketed as part one within the title, the problem is that I feel like unless you read the book and unless you paid very, very close attention to the marketing, specific, not the trailers, but like the articles and all the stuff that was being released around the movie like we did, I feel like a lot of people are not going to know that this is part one, that this is supposed to be part one of two parts. And because for my money, at least when I first saw the trailer, I wasn't sure, and I had a strange feeling. And I think it was like, there were a couple of interviews with Denny where he said that this was going to be two movies, but for the most part, this was marketed as one movie. And I think that's really confusing, especially considering that this is kind of really similar to what they did with Mortal Kombat earlier this year, where that thought it was going to be one movie that felt like there was going to be this, it felt like it was going to be this one solo movie. Then obviously they would figure out what to do after the movie came out, and the movie ends, and it doesn't even feel like a complete movie. And that's kind of what I wanted to get into.
So are you saying that this part 1 and 2 have both already been shot, or now he needs to get the green light and the funding to go shoot part 2?
So that was the impetus, and that's where the kind of the whole COVID factor comes in. Is this film, obviously pre-COVID, the impetus was going to be that it depended on this movie's box office to see whether it got a part 2. Because I think, and this is just me speculating, I'll say this. I think that the impetus, because they like working with Denis Villeneuve, and especially after they lost Chris Nolan, after Warner Brothers lost Chris Nolan last year during the pandemic, they were desperate to hold on to Denis. So I think the plan was the impetus before, because Blade Runner 2049 was a flop, definitely. Like it was a box office flop. It did not do well in the box office at all. So I think the impetus was that Denny and Warner Brothers, in their workings together, were trying to turn this into a franchise. And they were trying to figure out, okay, what's the best way that we can adapt this and be able to, because they're like, look, we cannot put this much money into just one solo movie and have it be another write-off. They were not willing to do that, not for a second time after Blade Runner. Arrival, they were able to get away with because Arrival got nominated for a bunch of Oscars, but Blade Runner was only nominated for technicals. Blade Runner did not get a Best Picture nomination. It did not get a Best Director nomination. And like, I know that we talk about the pointlessness of the Oscars, but for some reason, the studios still regard the Oscars as being important. Like, they will literally forego a movie if it wins Oscars, because Oscars will usually allow a movie to have some form of another life in the beginning of the following year. Like, it's still a chance for them to recoup some of their money. So this, I think, was an attempt. They're like, okay, we need a new franchise in order to compete, as something to back up DC, because I bet because they clearly still are not confident on DC. So they sat down to work this out, right? And the impetus was going to be that they were going to do part 1 and they were going to greenlight part 2 once, obviously, depending on the box office. And then COVID happened. And obviously the whole thing of as to, everything getting delayed, not knowing what was going to pop up and what, Denny being adamant that this needed to be seen in the theater, but then them, and obviously being rightfully angry with HBO Max because again, I jokingly, threw shots at him, but I will say I know that it wasn't his fault because it ultimately wasn't his decision at the end of the day as far as the choice to simultaneously release this. And yeah, it does kind of suck because it ultimately strips away, I feel, what he wanted people to witness this, which is he wanted people to witness this only in theaters. And it's one of those movies that I feel like does justify the theatrical experience. But again, it's like, if you have the HBO Max, it's like, and that's an option. Again, that's what throws things off and makes things so difficult. But there's a third element, I think, that has to be factored in, right? That's just the monetary aspect, just in general, right? And by the way, I did want to say, so well, obviously, in order to kind of counteract and finish that point off, it's that they did modify the arrangement and say, okay, now we're not going to base whether you get part 2 off of box office amount. We're going to base it off of how many of net views on HBO Max and subscribers increase because of this film.
Oh, that's good. That's because I really want the part 2 now that I know.
Because part 2 has been greenlit. I saw in a couple of things, but part 2 has been greenlit. What's
your source on that? Because I didn't get anything clear. I gotta
recheck, but I saw it from a couple of things that part 2 was officially greenlit.
All right. I'll look that up real quick just to make sure, because I tried to find, more reliable sources in the entertainment space like Vulture or Hollywood Reporter. And when I checked this morning with my coffee, I didn't see anything, but I'll double check real quick because I just don't want to because I really would love a part 2. And now that I know it's part 1 of 2, I think that's perfect. I felt like we said a lot in this first installment, and my thought process in the back of my brain was, maybe if this goes part 3, we might milk it a little bit. I mean, especially after I heard you speaking about getting through a large portion of the book. So it's good to hear that sort of is the impetus. That's good to hear. Yeah,
I can tell you right now that after seeing how much they covered in because even though this is still only part 1, they covered a lot in this movie. Like they pretty much covered like everything that was essentially covered before the butchering in the 84 Lynch version. Like they covered a lot in this movie. And again, it went from hour 40 to 2.5 hours. So I can tell you right now, there's no way they would be able to, I can tell you right now, if they made this into a trilogy rather than just another movie, rather than, as far as just based off this book, it would be worse than The Hobbit as far as stretching it out and just making it completely unnecessary. Like I definitely see with how much they covered this would only need to be 2 parts. The other obvious thing about this, just in general,
I just want to report there doesn't seem to be any up-to-date information. The most recent story from a reliable source comes from IGN, which says Dune Part 2 is all but confirmed. Villeneuve says the script is being worked on and he's ready to shoot, but he's waiting on the Warner Media CEO to make a decision. And that's kind of where it stands right now.
Okay.
I just think that's important because I think this is a very impactful and enjoyable film amongst a year of not many.
Yeah, not many, to say the least. Yeah, and it's really interesting that, like, again, we could talk about this in a sense of where it's like, okay, that this doesn't absolutely suck. But but that's just like kind of the behind the scenes of financials of it. But I think there's a third aspect of it that I think, I'm going to be honest right now, prevents this from being not an amazing movie, one of my favorites of the year, but ultimately ends up making it a really good movie, which is how it ends, where they choose, at what point they choose to end it, and why they made the decision to end it where they end it, which again kind of factors into all 3. But I wanted to talk about it first with the whole Denny as a director before we get into the HBO of it, because that does factor in, unfortunately, once I tell you again what how they've planned to already milk this franchise before it's even started, which is that with Denny as a director, I've watched 4 of his films before this: Prisoners, Sicario, Arrival, and Blade Runner 2049. And throughout all of those movies, I noticed 2 very apparent things about Denis as a director, and I think I've identified why he is such a divisive director. Despite his giant visual flair, his movies completely depend on the scripts, because famously, I think that they are make or break, obviously, by the scripts, because he doesn't write his own movies. So I think that's first and foremost. I think there are certain of his movies that are very much so propped up by the visuals, and certain of the movies that have some pretty damn good scripts to work with. And he's got a third act problem. He's got a major, major third act problem. Not nearly as bad as Stephen King, but every single movie that I've seen of his, they are so awesome and so enrapturing, and I'm so invested in it up until the last 10 to 15 minutes of every single one of his movies. I'm like, oh, what? Why'd you have to do that every single time? I think the only one that he gets away with it is Sicario. And even that movie, I have slight problems with how they handle points in the ending. But Sicario is, I think the reason why though is because Sicario is the most fully realized screenplay that he has to work out with. But like Prisoners, I'm with that movie all the way up until Melissa Leo throws Hugh Jackman in the hole. And I'm like, okay, this is stupid, you know? Arrival. I am famously not a fan of Arrival. I think that Arrival is the most overrated science fiction movie of the last 5 years. I don't understand the hype or appeal for that movie at all. I think if not for Denis directing that movie would be absolutely god awful. I hate that screenwriter, but that ending in particular annoys the shit out of me because it's one of those endings that feels like a gimmicky gotcha moment. And then Blade Runner 2049, I'll say, is damn near perfect up until the third act. The third act is what kind of brings that movie down from like close to a 5 to like more to a 4. Like that's to me how little I like the third act of Blade Runner 2049. And it's more compounded here because not only is the third act, I think specifically, not really the third act, but specifically the last like 10 minutes of this movie, to me, the weakest part, but it's also compounded with the fact that it's very clear that it's just setting up for more, which none of his previous movies have done. Like say what you will, but all of his previous movies with the problems with the ending, they felt like endings. This, and that goes into the other thing with the HBO Max thing, it feels like, I literally feel like the last shot of this movie is Zendaya literally turning and winking at the camera and be like, hey, be there for part 2. And I'm like, no. I'll deal with that with any other high class, high caliber Warner Brothers, blockbuster bullshit, but not from Denny. Denny, you're better than this,
Yeah, that felt a bit phoned in. It felt a bit amateur. Yeah. I will say the after we have this amazing sort of destruction of the house, and we see
too.
We see the betrayal play out in front of our eyes. Oscar Isaac makes the sacrifice as a great leader. It really was. It felt like, and I understand why maybe it felt like it should have been like an end credit sequence rather, but I understand that is also a lowbrow level of filmmaking. It almost felt like he was trapped again by those societal norms that I speak about here, but also I think that we could have started off the next film with what we ended this film with.
Yes,
absolutely. And I think if it was a matter of pacing and time, again, I think that all those slow motion shots and sequences that we had, specifically the dreams that kept coming around, where after a while, I know it wasn't recycled footage, but it started to feel that way to me.
Right.
Maybe we could have made certain creative choices. And again, this is where it comes down to, are we going to go full CinemaSins here and try to rewrite the movie for him? Or are we just going to like talk about it real quick, dip our toes and get out? Because again, like I don't want to ever really tell someone what to do with their art. But if my critique is that I think that it does fall apart, specifically in the third act. He really had me hooked in the first and second acts. Phenomenal characterizations to start this out. And once we get into the drama and the action and watch it all unfold, it was gripping and it was engaging. We have this awesome, again, as I said, climactic conclusion where we see the destruction of all these characters we love, the ultimate sacrifice, the betrayal, the sacrifice coming from, Jason Momoa's character, the betrayal by one of Oscar Isaac's informants and confidants, and then it's just so unfortunate that in the aftermath of all that, we finally see them cross the path of Shai Hulud, and that's interesting and that's cool. And I guess that is how it was written in the book. I think that does leave a difficult decision for any director, really, if that's how it comes up chronologically in the story, because that's why it's in one novel, and now you're breaking this up across multiple movies because of the mediums dictating it. But I just felt maybe we end off on them about to embark on the Shai Hulud path, and then we pick up again in the second film with them crossing that, the ultimate test of rising to his strength as a character to start off the second movie, and then seeing that unfold and finish. And maybe that the next part goes for 3 hours. I think that's acceptable, considering the fact that this is a part 1 of 2, now that I know that for sure. And because it's such an epic, and we know we're sitting down for an epic, and if the new James Bond film was almost 3 hours, this clearly is more justifiable than that, which I thought was a great film and earned its runtime. And side note, there's a legendary hardcore band called Shai Hulud, and I've seen them many times and played many shows with them, and now I know what that means and where that comes from. But yeah, I don't know. That's just sort of my my take on it all in regards to the third act troubles, because they are there, and I agree with you when you bring
Yeah.
that up.
Yeah, and like I said, I wish it was a thing that was exclusive to this movie. I think they're just compounded kind of by the inherent nature of this being broken up into multiple parts, but it's the fact that it's been there with every single Denis Villeneuve movie I've watched, with the exception of Arrival, which I just didn't like in general. I'm like, it's the same thing every time. It's like, it's so awesome up until the last 10 to 15 minutes, and then I'm like, oh, what? Why did you do that? It's like Stephen King. It's like, what? This kind of came out of nowhere just in general. And kind of the only other thing that I'll say just in general about that is, I don't know. I don't want to go into the decision making as far as where they chose to end it, because again, it's very difficult in order to try and figure out, like, specifically at that point. It's like, okay, do you go right after the fall? Obviously, you need to have the Duke's death in this. I think that's really important. I think that's like really important as a solidifying factor. But in order to also talk about your points about the slow-mo sequences just in general, the crazy thing about that is, again, that's not necessarily inherent to this movie. That is beat for beat. That is literally beat for beat, like, pulled from the novel, just in general, like that. All those sequences of Paul having the dreams and the visions, that's from the novel. That is adapted from the source material in general. So that's not necessarily anything that you could say is like a creative, like, choice endeavor, because again, they just did it. Now, would that have
Well, I
impacted the
think it
final?
is because they didn't have to do it in slow mo,
True. Yeah, definitely. That was
and
this
they
whole
didn't,
thing.
and then they could have offered more there, and they didn't have to
Yeah,
have as many of them throughout it.
right. It
It's all
felt
the way he chose to portray it. I know
right.
it's in the novel, just like I know that one moment where they do that one B-roll shot where they just remind you, hey, there are these giant worms on the planet. I'm sure that in between, like, paragraphs, there was a quick moment where Herbert might have written something that I've seen in novels before, where it's like, and you know, the worms were like sensing the restlessness or whatever. I don't know his style, but like, I understood that that was sort of like a, yeah, Herbert's keeping the world alive in the novel, and so this is his way of doing that. But I just think it's the choices that the director then gets to make in the adaptation
Right.
that
Well,
we
that
can
well,
critique.
Well, the other aspect of this at all that folds in, again, my problems, not necessarily with this movie, but again, just with HBO Max and how they seem to be taking this direction with every single movie that Warner Brothers is doing now, which is, so obviously there was the news that broke out back when this movie was announced. I think it was like right when the first trailer dropped, that they would be doing a Bene Gesserit spin-off TV series. And I'm like, okay. But it just worries me, because I'm like, oh, great. So they're just using this as more marketing in order to launch a Dune cinematic universe. And I'm like, the thing that kills me about that is that kind of ruins the anticipation and joy that I have for this movie, because once again, like Warner Brothers does, it's another instance of where it's like, okay, now instead of, just having to look forward to the next movie, it's now, okay, now I have to look forward to an entire other Dune spin-off cinematic universe just in general. And the problem is that with where they choose to end it, and with just the inherent nature of them splitting it up, look, there's a long history of there's a long track record history of movies as far as how to do a part one and part two properly, just in general, where you want to make them feel like full, complete instances of themselves. I think the Harry Potter films, and same as well, but I think Infinity War and Endgame are great examples for that. Obviously, again, the problems and why you can't really compare them is those two are both ending franchises, and the difference is also you're building off of a giant set of universes and history of characters that you've come to know over a certain period of time. This instance, you're getting introduced to this world, you're getting introduced to these characters, half of whom are not alive by the end of this film. So that was already going to be a trick to me in general. So I guess just my whole thought process is, I'm like, okay, you already had the legwork, obviously, with Snyder's Cut. And again, there's only so much that I can say, because this film obviously was already in development and ready to go before the whole COVID shutdown. But my whole thing was that I'm like, okay, if you really wanted to launch this as a cinematic universe, right, rather than have this be part one and two, just do it as one movie. Give it the extra time. Give it the 3 hour, give it the 3.5 hour runtime. I don't know about you. I was fully engaged for this entire 2.5 hours up until the last 10 to 15 minutes when it started to lose me, where I'm like, okay, this is just them doing and wrap up in order to do it. I'm like, I was kind of inherently biased from the beginning, because when I heard the decision that they were going to do it in two parts, I'll admit I wasn't necessarily excited, because I'm like, I truly, because I knew that there were other novels, right? And I knew that they would probably be able to do this right. I'm like, okay, I definitely think that they could have done this in one movie. I really, really do believe that. I truly, truly do believe that. And especially with the HBO Max news after it, and my thoughts have not necessarily changed in
Yeah,
general.
I
What
think there
that
was
could have been, yeah,
a lot of pacing issues here, and a lot of time that
Absolutely.
didn't quite justify the 2.5 hours.
Right.
I was engaged because, again, like I said, while I recognize those issues, I do enjoy this type of filmmaking, the elegance, the maturity there that I don't really find from the big sci-fi epics or blockbusters of the day, the things that I love of yesteryear that I've spoken about quite frequently and in length about on this show. So yeah, it was fine with me, but I'm still a critic at the end of the day, and I still understand that there were some issues there with that. And
Yeah.
I haven't read the book, so I don't know how much he didn't cover, but I trust your judgment when you say that this could have been a little
Yeah,
more of a
I really do.
compacted one movie story.
Well, because the trick is that a lot of the stuff that happens in the whole thing is this does feel like the Campbell's hero's journey, right? And the problem with that is the hero's journey to me only works with the full, what is it you said, the full cosmogenic cycle, right? And just inherently how this works as a movie and within like just storytelling in general. Obviously, we're still in this massive change where again, we don't know what even defines a movie versus a TV show versus a miniseries. We don't even know because the terms have been broken down so far. But I think it's a little bit to the detriment of the art form when you feel like you're only getting half a story. It would have been one thing if this had ended and we still had the entire second half of the novel to go, but it ended in a really satisfying and really meaty, juicy way that felt like you'd gotten an entire whole one picture arc, but that was building up to more. And that's not what I got here, unfortunately. What I got is literally something that felt like half of a story. The half that I got was really good, but it's still just half a story. And so ultimately, because of that, the ending is gonna leave me a little bit unsatisfied.
Yeah, I feel like I do watching the last 2 seasons of Game of Thrones where I'm left wanting more. You still have the characters that you know and love, and they're still great, but something was missing. And I
Yeah,
think that I really don't know what else to say in regards to our conversation here
yeah,
about Dune and all that, because I want to, I think we've made great cases, and I think we've again said we do appreciate this as a film, but we're critics and we understand that like it's not perfect, and I am not the most familiar with Villeneuve's catalog, at least as you are, having only others seen 2049, but the problems I can see them presenting themselves, rearing their
yeah.
ugly head, if you will, in the third act. And I'm curious now to go and check out the likes of Sicario and Arrival and see if I find the
Definitely.
same issues that others have,
Yeah,
Prisoners as
and
well. So.
and Prisoners, definitely Prisoners. I think is a must. Yeah, look, all I'm gonna say is it's definitely gonna be interesting. Obviously, when and if part two gets the green light, I'm gonna be really interested to see because again, part two. Let's just say that if it's very much like the last of Harry Potter movies, where part one is all the setup and the interest and the introduction of the characters in the world, but part two is not like crazy nonstop like psychedelic, like Paul becoming the Muad'Dib and like having like these crazy inherent like galaxy reaching psychic powers, and then the Fremen just full up straight up revolution against the Harkonnens, and like it gets bloody in the last there. And we also haven't even met the Baron's other nephew, Fade Routha, Beast Raven's brother, who famously in the original was portrayed by Sting. That was the only part that they didn't cast. Oh, absolutely, yeah. And we haven't actually met the Potty Shot Emperor yet, who also does come into play. Like there's still a lot left on the table that if this were the only movie that we got would feel very unsatisfied. But I think ultimately at the end of the day, my final thoughts come down to my thoughts on this are kind of originally the same as Halloween 2. It's if and when part 2 comes out, it'll be great as this one gigantic 5-hour long epic fantasy. But with just this movie in general, it still feels like only part of a whole. It doesn't feel like a complete story, which again is really all that I asked for as far as movies go. And for it to be missing that one kind of crucial element, it kind of drags everything else down a peg, which everything else is perfect for starters. So that's what dragged this from being a 4.5 for me down to like, I haven't quite settled yet whether it's a 3.5 or a 4. I don't think it's too low to be a 3.5 because the scale and the scope for the first 2/3 is still there, and it's so well done and it's so incredible. But that third act, man, I'm right there because I'll say about a 3.8 out of 5. How about that? I haven't done that in a while, but I think this movie deserves it.
That's fair. I love everything you just sort of said in your conclusion there. I agree with it wholeheartedly. This is a tough one to critique, and I think it is one of those situations where you'd want to, once the second part comes out, if you have that rainy Sunday and you just want to relax, maybe you put them both on back to back, and the experience is to the fullest degree. And I think that's kind of what we're getting at here. I really hope the second one comes, even with all of my critiques of it. It's still a very well made film. It's still very gripping, very engaging. These are the types of characterizations I love. This is the type of sci-fi that I miss. And so because of all that, while I do see its flaws, I think it has far more triumphs and far more greater moments than it does moments that maybe felt out of pace or poorly paced. So with that being said, I'm going to have to go with a 3.5. only because I want to be hard on it so that part 2 can deliver what I'm hoping it does.
Seriously, because that's the thing. Like, if this, it's quite literally the total opposite of last week with Halloween, where if this gets the green light and if he does part 2 the right way, and again, and this is going to be an even trickier part because again, like I said, Denny is terrible with third acts, but this could be his attempt to really improve because this, oh my God, dude, I shit you not, the third act of that book is the third act to end all third acts, with them riding around on sandworms, and there's this little 5-year-old girl with crazy psychic powers, and and we haven't even gotten into, like, you know, the Spice Guild in general and all the other crazy politics going on. Like, it's, if they do it, I think they could have a chance to really do this right, and it could be the opposite of Halloween, where we could get something really freaking awesome and really freaking special with this in general. But that's really it. That's really all I have to say. Like I said, great introduction. I think, again, it's so funny because I think this is the perfect talent to describe it. They got it just right, but only just, if that makes anything sense. If that makes any sense.
I'm right there with you.
I think that's like the best way to describe it, ultimately,
it is,
at the end of the day, without saying too much. But that was it. That was our review of Denis Villeneuve's Dune. I guess the only thing to look forward to now will be to see whether this gets the amount of Oscars that people think that it's going to, because I personally think it definitely deserves all the accolades. I think it deserves cinematography, editing, sound, production design, costume, visuals, all of the above. It's amazing from that sense. I'm 50-50 on whether Denis should get a director nomination on this, but I think that if he were to get one, it would be way more well-deserved than his Arrival nomination. And yeah, I think it'll just be interesting to see what this film does going forward culturally, in addition to box office wise and franchise wise, obviously, because I think this is one of the few that really is one of the very few films that comes out that does cross both thresholds, if you will. So that was it. That was our review of 2021 Denis Villeneuve's Dune. Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. Let us know, are we off a rocker? Did you guys like this? What do you guys think about their treatment of this as part 1 versus part 2? Whatever they are, leave them in the comment section below. Be sure to click the subscribe button, click the like button, click the bell to get notified every time we put up new content. You guys know what to do. You guys are our devoted, loyal fans. You guys have been there for us since day one. Chris, where can the good people find you?
Yeah, they can find me anywhere that matters, and anywhere that our podcast also is, Instagram, Facebook, and I'm also additionally on Twitter. God knows why, but I am at Christian Evanko. Evanko spelled Evanko. I make music, which you can find by clicking the link in my bio on all of those platforms. The About button on Facebook, as I've now learned to specify. And also, I have a second podcast, which we're gearing up for another season. It's a show about life, music, and everything in between, called Talking with Andrew and Chris, where we sit down and interview artists and sort of break down their psyche. We're doing sort of like a little local highlight here. We have a lot of great musicians in our area that are putting out some really cool tunes, so we figured it's time to dust off the old podcasting chops on that show, just to help out some friends. And with the holidays coming around, it only felt right to give our friends some promotion. If we can help, that'd be great. So hopefully you guys go and listen to all those things and keep up to date with everything I do outside of this show. And of course, continue to support our podcast. We really appreciate you all so very much. And we say it because we mean it. And I also say this because I mean it. Dom, when he chooses to post, is very entertaining and very hilarious. And I hope he will post again soon. So Dom, where can the people find you on social media?
At Facebook and Instagram at Movie Nerd Reviews. I don't know when I'm going to post again, to be completely honest. How about this? I haven't had an Instagram worthy moment in a while, just in general, but you guys can follow me there if you so choose to follow me. But really, you could follow us on our Facebook and Instagram pages at Talkin' TV Podcast, all one word. You guys can find those in the links in the description in general, where I post every single day, twice a day, letting you guys know about everything that we have going on. That was it. As we say, fear is the mind killer. 12 seasons in a short film. Watch more fucking movies. I will see you guys next time.